Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to do a charcoal drawing of this countryside landscape with a winding path, some trees and a fence. Let's start. So first I'm going to do a sketch with a pencil, and then I'm going to switch to charcoal. I need to make sure that I know where everything will be. Now, as for the materials, I'm working on Fabriano drawing paper, and I'm going to be working with Maestro woodless charcoal pencils. I'm also going to use some willow charcoal and charcoal powder, in addition to some of the other blending and erasing tools. So the winding path is going to be roughly here in the middle. After that, I'm going to put down some charcoal powder here in the top part of the scene, because I want this to have a little bit of value. It's going to be lighter than the rest of the scene, obviously, because it's the sky. Now, first I'm going to try to distribute it evenly with a brush, like so. And then I'm going to blend with a paper towel. So I want to have a roughly the same amount of it in different parts of this upper portion of the paper. And once I've distributed it evenly, I can start blending, and I can use a paper towel or a paper tissue or something and use a circular motion like this. The idea is to make it look smooth and even without any texture. Now, if you feel like this might end up being too dark, the trick that you can use is to put a little bit of white chalk into your charcoal powder. That will make it a little bit lighter. Once that is finished, I can just go over it one more time with a larger brush. It looks very smooth and very light. And once I have that background in place, I can start working on other elements, namely this tree, this overhanging tree at the top of the scene. The reference is going to be in the description. So what I'm doing here is I'm trying to imitate the appearance of leaves and clusters of leaves, and to do that I'm just using a fairly sharp charcoal pencil and making very small marks, kind of going back and forth or using a circular motion to create something that looks like foliage. It's not about trying to draw every single leaf. The idea is to create a kind of a texture that resembles foliage as seen from a distance. Now, it's not quite as easy as it looks. The thing is that you have to try to change your stroke. You have to vary the length and the size of those marks. And you also want to vary the direction a little bit, because that'll make it look more natural. On top of that, I will add some darker marks with a soft charcoal pencil. By the way, I'm using two grades of these Maestro woodless charcoal pencils, a medium and a soft. The soft one obviously is softer but also darker. So I can use it to create some of these darker, deeper shadow areas in the foliage. Now, once I have that, it's time to connect these clusters of leaves with some branches and twigs. And to do that, again, I have to switch back to the medium charcoal pencil, because it's a little bit harder and it gives me an opportunity to draw slightly cleaner lines, which I need for these branches. and then I can sort of go back and forth between drawing foliage and some branches in the spaces in between. With these branches you don't want to overdo it, because most of the time foliage will be obscuring the branches, so you don't want to have the entire branch visible. You want to have some parts of it hidden behind the foliage. Now, as for the branches, I can't really give you too many tips other than to try to practice, but they do have to taper as they grow out. And you also want to try to wiggle your hand a little bit so that you can create a little bit more natural looking curved shapes, because branches bend and twist every which way. And it's the same thing with foliage. That's one of the reasons why I told you that you need to vary the direction of your strokes. So I'm just making more progress here to the right side of the top part of the scene, which is mostly going to be covered with this foliage, with this canopy which is protruding into the scene at the top and hanging over the path. I'm just making sure that it looks dense enough, that I have enough of those marks, and I'm also going over them with that soft charcoal pencil again, adding those darker shadow areas, because I want to have a little bit of range of value in there so that I can create some illusion of smaller shapes or segments. Once that initial work on the texture and the details is done, I can start working a little bit with some blending tools. I'm using a tortillon to dab on some of these marks. The reason why I did that is because I wanted to soften some of the texture. Now the other thing I can do is what I'm doing here. I'm using a tiny piece of willow charcoal. It's soft natural charcoal, and it leaves, because of its irregular shape, it leaves slightly larger marks, and I can control the amount of value and the size depending on the marks that I make. So that kind of softened the appearance of the canopy and the leaves a little bit and made them look a little bit larger, a little bit less grainy, if you will. And then I simply went back and worked a little bit more with this soft charcoal pencil to make some parts of the top part of the scene even darker. So like I said, the idea here is that we have some overhanging branches, because this part of the canopy of the tree is growing over the path below, or above the path below, and it's also going to be casting a little bit of shadow down. But I'm going to get to that later. Right now I just want to finish this part of the canopy here, and I'm just drawing some more branches and some more leaves. You can also leave some of the branches maybe bare, not covered with foliage, maybe slightly broken off, just for the sake of variety. And like I said, it's very important for you to try to vary the direction and the shape of those small marks when you're drawing foliage, because you don't want to make them look uniform, like they're all in the same direction, like they're all same a set of parallel lines. You want to have a little bit of variety there. Now that I have this top part of the scene more or less done, I'm using a kneaded eraser to dab on some parts of the sky to make it a little bit lighter, to create some suggestions of clouds. And I can finally refine their shape a little bit more using a pencil eraser. This is a Kohinoor pencil eraser in a pencil. So these are very light, barely noticeable, but they're still there, and they're going to make the scene look a little bit more interesting, because otherwise it would just be plain sky. I'm going to have another one slightly larger and more conspicuous here on the left. Now that I have all of that in place, I'm going to start working on these trees, and I have a row of trees here in the distance. So I'm going to start working on those. Now my approach to drawing these is kind of similar to drawing the foliage above, but it's going to be simpler. I'm not going to worry that much about the texture, and I'm going to try to simplify the texture a little bit later with blending tools. And the reason why I want to do that is because I don't want to make it too distracting, because the stuff that is in the foreground needs to be more detailed, have more texture, because it's the texture that gives that illusion of detail. There's going to be a little bit more shadow here at the bottom, obviously, because the light source is coming from above. And now, as you can see, I'm softening that with a tortillon to blend that a little bit, to soften that texture. And what seems to work even better is a Q-tip. It blends very nicely. And I'm getting the type of, the amount of detail that I want. Because as I've already explained, these objects are further in the distance and therefore they need to be a little bit less defined. I still need to add a little bit of detail on them so that they don't look too flat, which is why I'm going back with a pencil again and adding some suggestions of darker areas in between those larger shapes, kind of trying to divide those larger shapes into smaller segments, like the viewer can see that these are multiple trees, bushes and stuff like that. So you want to divide this large mass of trees into smaller shapes, and the good thing about this is that you don't really need to do too much. With just a few of these shadow areas you can create an illusion like there are lots of trees back there. A little bit more blending, because every time you apply a pencil that creates a little bit of texture, a little bit of additional texture. So it's up to you to decide how much texture you want to have. You can always knock that back a little bit. You can also use a brush. I'm using a soft synthetic brush here, which softens the texture quite a bit. Now it's time to start working on this tree, which is in the center of the scene. This one is in front of that row of trees. It's much closer to our viewpoint, so it's going to be a lot larger, taller, and more detailed. First I'm drawing a little bit of those branches and the tree trunk, of course. Again, I need to use a well sharpened medium charcoal pencil for this, because that will give me very nice clean marks. And notice that I'm drawing these interrupted shapes. That's because I want some parts of that system of branches to be obscured by the foliage, by the canopy. And once I have that, I can start working on the foliage using the same approach that I did with the larger tree at the top. This one is going to have a slightly different shape, but my approach to drawing the foliage is going to be similar. I'm just going to keep these strokes, these marks that I'm creating, very short and very small, and I'm going to move from one segment onto another, creating larger clusters of leaves while at the same time creating an interesting looking texture. I'm also going to need to make this lower part of the canopy here at the bottom a little bit darker for two reasons. First, because obviously it's down, so it's facing away from the light source, so it needs to be darker. Plus I want it to stand out against that background, so I might want to make it even darker than I initially planned. I'm doing the same thing on the other side, just wiggling the pencil, creating those small marks. But notice how I'm not really trying to cover everything. I'm deliberately leaving some lighter spaces in between, because I want to make it look like the canopy is not completely obscuring the background. So it needs to have a lot of holes in it. We can see the sky through it. So we want to have lots of smaller groups of those leaves, lots of smaller clusters of leaves. But once you have the general shape in place, you can start going back and adding some darker areas here and there to make the canopy look more dense and darker in those places. And that's going to create an illusion of the volume and density of that foliage. I will eventually have to use blending tools as well, because it's creating a very fine texture that kind of looks like foliage, but it could be a little bit more convincing, and there's too many of those white spaces in between where the charcoal didn't get through, and that's why you need blending tools. But first I need to do the work with a pencil, and I need to be patient about it. Just finishing this lower left portion of that tree, and now you can see that it's starting to look like an actual tree in terms of the overall shape and in terms of those segments or clusters of foliage. And now I'm just dabbing on some parts of it with a brush to push the charcoal into some of those smaller spaces which weren't covered with charcoal dust. And as a final touch, I'm going in with a darker soft charcoal pencil to make some parts of the canopy even darker, because those are the shadow areas. I'm just kind of hoping that I've created a natural looking canopy of a tree, although I can always go back and modify it slightly. But now I need to continue with that row of trees to the right. I'm just adding a few more lighter touches to the sky, and now I'm going to continue with these trees in the background. I probably could have finished the entire row and then draw the tree, but I don't know, I just felt like doing it this way. But I'm going to use the same approach here. I'm not going to worry that much about the texture. I'm just going to lay down a sufficient amount of value and then blend it. And I'm going to blend it with a Q-tip, because that's what proved to be the most useful blending tool here for this part of the scene. You always want to use multiple drawing tools or multiple types of drawing tools, because they all have their advantages and disadvantages. You want to play around with them and see what works best in which situation. I'm adding a little bit more shadow here at the bottom, because those trees are going to be casting a bit of shadow down, because the light source is coming from the sky, from above, and adding a little bit more of those shadow areas on this right side of that row of trees. Now at one point my son came over to tell me that I mustn't forget to draw the fence.
Od ogrody idę, wiesz, że tu na prawie ogród.
Dobra, dojdź do.
Dobra?
Dobra.
And of course I'm going to put in the fence, but I'm going to simplify it a little bit. So now I'm just shading this grassy area here. I just used a little bit of willow charcoal for that, because I need to establish some base value before I start working on the texture. And of course I'm blending that with a Q-tip again. I'm going to add some smaller details here in this part of the scene, to the left of the tree, maybe like a small darker bush here. Because I see that in the reference, so why not throw it in to make the scene a little bit more interesting. There's another bush here in front of it. This one is a little bit larger and a little bit lighter in value. It also has some sort of flowers or something. Can't really tell, but I'm going to try to draw it in a similar way, but first I need to establish a little bit of darker value so that I could draw those lighter marks on top and do a little bit of blending. So once I have the darker value in place, I can use an eraser to draw some lighter marks that kind of look like flowers or something. There's only so much you can do when you put down the charcoal, and when you blend it, it won't erase very clean marks, but honestly I don't need them to be very clean because this part of the scene is still a little bit further away from our viewpoint, so I'm still going to have some stuff which is closer to the viewpoint, closer to the foreground, which is going to appear more detailed. Here I'm working on the texture of the grass, drawing blades of grass and clumps of grass. I'm going to make a lot of these vertical marks varying the direction ever so slightly, just to lay down that texture. It's not going to look like that once I'm finished. But once I have enough of them, those are supposed to look like some of the darker areas or shadow areas in the grass, and I'm gonna blend them with a brush. I'm using a harder bristle brush now, and it has an interesting effect because it does blend, but because it's hard, it also pushes the charcoal into the grain of the paper, allowing me to retain some of the texture, some of the contrast between those lighter and darker areas. Once I feel that it's dark enough and the texture is in place, I can put down finishing touches using a pencil eraser, where I can draw some lighter marks that kind of look like blades of grass or lighter clumps of grass. These are those portions of the grass which are sticking out and catching more light from above. And you don't need to draw every single blade of grass, just a few marks here and there, a few suggestions here and there, and that should probably do it. Because I always like to try to simplify things to a certain degree and to try to make something look realistic without actually having to draw every single detail, because that's no fun, or at least it's not, in my opinion. Anyway, just putting down some finishing touches on this grassy area here to the left, because this edge of that grassy area next to the dirt path is going to be a little bit irregular. And then I'm moving on to shading the other side. The best and the quickest way to shade it is, of course, by using willow charcoal again. Willow charcoal or vine charcoal are those natural charcoal sticks. You can actually create those yourself by burning wood, and they work great as a drawing tool. A good thing about this willow charcoal is that it's so easily manipulated. You can easily blend it and move it around, and you can also easily lift up a little bit of it if you want to make a certain area a little bit lighter, if you want to erase it. But for me, I just wanted to shade this part of the scene a little bit more quickly. Now the fence is going to be here. But if you compare it to the reference, I did simplify it a little bit. I didn't want some of these smaller shapes to be too distracting. And I wanted it to look a little bit, how should I put it, older, simpler, and more worn down. And a little bit of shadow under the tree here, because the tree is going to be casting a bit of shadow down onto that grassy area. So you want to integrate each of these vertical objects into the scene by adding a little bit of shadow under it. That's going to make it look more realistic, and it's going to make the scene look more realistic. And now I have some more bushes here on the right. This first one is going to be a little bit darker, a little bit taller. Maybe it's like a smaller tree or a larger bush, I don't really know, it doesn't really matter. So I first did that, and then I moved on to drawing some more bushes here to the right of it. And you can see how I'm approaching this by mostly focusing on those shadow areas between the larger bushes and the larger clusters of foliage, because I want to indicate where some of the larger shapes are. And that way I can do less work, because I already have that base value in between those darker shadow areas. And I can add a little bit of texture on top by just dragging my pencil like so. I keep talking about texture. Texture is what is created randomly by simply applying the pencil to the paper, because whenever the pencil interacts with the paper, even if it's a smoother paper, it will create a little bit of texture. And you can always use that texture to create illusion of detail. That's what I call allowing the pencil to work for you. Sometimes when you don't need a texture, you can soften it with blending tools, and sometimes you can use it to your advantage. So I've done a little bit more work on this right side of that grassy area, to the right of the path. And now I'm just adding some darker details using a charcoal pencil again to indicate where there are some shadow areas in that grass. And then on top of that I'm using a pencil eraser to pull some lighter marks. So these shadow areas, when you're drawing grass, they're not just creating variation in terms of indicating where some of the larger clumps of grass may be, but also variation in the terrain, because it's not supposed to look very flat and even. So a little bit of variation when you're drawing landscapes, some randomness is always a good thing. Now I'm going to make some part of the grass here a little bit darker. I'm just going to draw darker blades of grass, and that's going to look to the viewer like the trees above are casting a bit of shadow onto the grassy area below. So I'm going to play around with that a little bit to see what kind of shadows and what kind of shapes I can come up with. And I'm going to finish it off with a dirt path in the middle. In the middle of the path we're going to have a little bit more of this grass, and on both sides of it the ground is going to be trodden without any grass, and the grass here in the middle is going to be a little bit less dense and a little bit shorter. First I'm going to lay down a little bit of value and texture just by dragging my pencil like this, shading gently, then doing a little bit of blending, and then adding a little bit of random texture and value to the path itself, and a little bit of blending. And then I'm going to refine the edges of the grass on both sides of the path and on this thin grassy strip in the middle. I'm going to draw some grass on it first by dragging my pencil, and then by making short marks, because one of the things that I forgot to mention is when you're drawing grass you want to make shorter marks in the distance and larger and taller marks in the foreground, because obviously the closer the blades of grass and the clumps of grass to our viewpoint, the larger they're going to appear to us. And the further away they are, they're going to be getting smaller and smaller and less discernible. So that's another thing to remember when you're drawing grass. It doesn't have to look perfect, but as long as you can create a little bit of variation in size and make sure that the ones that are closer to our viewpoint are a little bit larger, the viewer will get the point and the eye will be able to pick up on that difference. I'm also adding a little bit of shadow to the path itself, because it's not just the grass that's going to be darker because of those trees, those overhanging branches. And the shadow here doesn't even have to come from the tree at the top there. It could be some other tree, doesn't really matter, because there are trees all around. Just adding a little bit more shadow, some random shadow areas on the path and on the grass. Because it's a canopy of the tree, we're going to have some irregular shapes. Some parts of it will be casting a shadow, others will be letting a little bit more light through. I didn't like some of the shapes, so I decided to simplify the shadow a little bit, so I dabbed on some parts with a kneaded eraser to remove them. And I think I ended up with something that looks, you know, like a fairly convincing shadow in the foreground area. So now that's pretty much done. I need to remove the tape, and people often ask me how to remove the protective tape without damaging the drawing. The trick is to pull it a tiny bit at a time, and not to pull it away all at once, but to hold it under a tight angle, and that'll minimize the chance of actually tearing the paper. I'm drawing some of these marks down the length of the dirt path to give it a little bit of texture, to indicate like it's, you know, it's being used by all kinds of vehicles. And then just modifying the edges of that path a little bit so that it looks more irregular and more random. Finally, I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner, and I'm going to draw my signature with a pencil eraser. So the drawing is pretty much done. I've removed the tape, and I'm just dabbing on the canopy a little bit more to make it look a little bit more dense. Just want to fill in some of the white spaces. I don't want too many of them. So I'm putting down a few finishing touches, and it's time to wrap things up. I want to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already, and to check out my other videos. Also give me a like and comment, let me know what you think. So this is the finished drawing. If you want to see longer videos, full-length videos and more content, you need to check out my Patreon. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.